All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today for the fourth talk of our winter lecture series. For those of you who haven't been here for one of our talks, this is a new program for us at the DuPont Nature Center. The wintertime, things really slow down for us, but we want to continue to find ways to bring new and engaging programming to y'all. And the nice thing about wintertime is we kind of get to take a step back and find new and different ways to bring program. And this is where this idea of this lecture series came. We've showcased a lot of people we work with fish and wildlife. And today we're actually having our very own naturalist, Regan, here to talk about this. That's right, yes. Before we start the program today, again, thanks for joining us. If you guys have any questions at all, just raise your hand. She's happy to answer anything and everything that comes to mind. For those of you who are joining us online, please just type your answers into the chat and we'll get to your answers at the end of the presentation. And as well, for those of you here today, if anyone needs to hit the bathroom, they're located right behind the wall there. So again, I'm extra excited to announce our guest speaker as our very own DuPont Nature Center Naturalist, Regan Todd. Regan's background is in environmental biology, but since she started with us here last summer, she's developed an array of exciting programs from understanding the life cycle of whales to breaking down the ecology of our local beaches and a lot more. And so while Regan's role here is not solely dedicated to researching and studying horseshoe crabs, if you asked any of us who work here or spend a lot of time here, we'd all probably say about 90% of our work still does focus on horseshoe crabs one way or the other. So when we were working on this series, Regan actually jumped at that opportunity to kind of share that knowledge she had, but get the extra kind of chance that we have here in the wintertime with some more time to dive a little bit deeper into it than we normally get with our kind of general visitors. So join me in welcoming Regan as she takes us through the long journey of our horseshoe crab's evolutionary history, diving far beyond where most of our minds may go, so to better understand this anciently modern species. So I'm going to let Regan take it away.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone here and online. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. As Patrick mentioned, this is something that like a lot of people come in here and they want to know about horseshoe crabs, but we don't always get to talk about kind of the more detailed stuff like how did they evolve, how long have they been around? So this has been a really exciting thing for me to start learning about, to really jump into, and I'm really glad that I get to share all of this with you. I think everyone should be able to see my screen. So we'll get started. My program is called Living Fossils or Modern Wonders, Evolution of the Horseshoe Crab. And so I'll kind of lead with these pictures and this question of has anything changed? And so on the left, we have a fossil of a horseshoe crab, and on the right, we have a picture of a horseshoe crab that could have been taken, within the last 10 years. And to many of us, when we're looking at these, they look pretty similar. So it's easy for us to think, I don't know, I don't really think anything has changed. And I'll give you the short answer to this question is yes, things have changed. But we're going to really dive into how things have changed and when those changes have happened. So when we're doing a study like this, if we're working with like our modern horseshoe crabs, a lot of really exciting research is happening, but there's also lots of exciting research happening with our horseshoe crabs that are fossilized, that are no longer with us. And so if we're going to really get into that, we have to first kind of understand how that fossilization happened. So just brief overview of fossilization and especially of horseshoe crabs. I want to mention that it's not actually that common. And so horseshoe crabs, we do have tons of fossils of, but compared to other taxa, we actually don't have that many. And so horseshoe crabs, their exoskeleton or their shell is made of chitin, which is nice and sturdy for them. It really helps them to move around in their environment, but in the grand scheme of things is not actually that strong. So it's not as strong as like teeth or bones. And so it's less likely that that is going to fossilize than something like a bone will, but we do still get that. And then any of our soft parts of our horseshoe crab or any other organism are more likely to decompose than they are to become fossilized. And so we have just a quick little graphic here of kind of how this process happens. First, our organism has to die, and then it becomes buried in sediment. And then that sediment is going to layer up in a process called lithification. And so the sediment forms layers, the water gets pushed out, everything gets nice and pressurized. The next step is petrification. And so any of that organic material that's left is going to get replaced by minerals. And that's what we're seeing when we're looking at our fossil. And then eventually our fossil has to be exposed for us to find it. And so a lot of times that process will start kind of naturally through erosion, but then people can kind of happen upon fossils accidentally when they're mining, or they can kind of dig intentionally for them. And that's what happened with our horseshoe crabs. And now they've created this really awesome, great story that we can go through. And so our story starts long, long ago. So that's where we'll go. looks like maybe I jumped a little far back in time, maybe too far. So we're gonna jump forward just a little bit. And I think we actually want to start here. And so we're in the Cambrian period, which happened between 541 and 485 million years ago. And so we're thinking about these big hundreds of millions of years ago, kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around maybe. So I want to provide you with a fun little illustration of how we can visualize this geologic time. So if you hold out your arm and you start at your shoulder, that's going to be when the Earth forms. Around your elbow, forearm is where we're getting our single-celled organisms. And then the Cambrian period that I just mentioned isn't actually happening until our palm. So we have a long stretch of time before this, even though 541 million years ago feels really, really long ago to us. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that far back in time, especially on our little arm diagram. And if you're curious about where humans come in, on the very tip of your finger, if you took a nail file and just swiped it a couple times, you would erase the human. So we really haven't been around that long. But for today, we're going to start in the Cambrian period in our palm and kind of work our way through our hand. So we're in the Cambrian period. In the bottom right corner, we've got a visual of what we think the Earth might have looked like. So we don't have any continents like we know of today. The Earth looked very different. Also, a lot of our continents are kind of on the southern part of the Earth. Our climate would have been really warm and tropical. And so when we say warm, this is relative. Those temperatures still would have been a lot higher than they are today. We also in our atmosphere had a really high level of CO2, and the amount of oxygen or O2 in our atmosphere, especially in our oceans, was starting to increase. And that oxygenation is one of the things that we think maybe caused the Cambrian explosion. So if you're familiar with the Cambrian explosion, this is a point in the fossil record where we see a lot of different organisms start to emerge. And so we're not exactly sure if they were evolving then or if that's just when they show up in the fossil record, but that's what we have to work with. So we see a lot of diversity starting at this time. We also are starting to evolve defense mechanisms in hard parts, so like bones, teeth. And so our animals are starting to become predators. And so they can defend themselves, they can start to hunt for other animals, and that's going to drive a lot of changes in our ecosystem. Another big evolution that we get at this time are arthropods, which are segmented, they have jointed legs, things like insects, crustaceans, those are our arthropods. But one of our arthropods from the Cambrian period are the trilobites, which are going to be really important. And so we're not yet at our horseshoe crab, but we do have trilobites during the Cambrian period, which are not an ancestor of a horseshoe crab. Sometimes people like to think that the horseshoe crabs evolved from trilobites, which isn't true, but they are a close relative of our horseshoe crab. They appeared early in the Cambrian period, and they were pretty diverse, especially compared to our horseshoe crab, and specialized. And so they ranged in size, and they also ranged in their ecological niches. So some of them were predators, some of them were scavengers. They're doing all kinds of things all over our oceans. Something else that's really special about our trilobites is that they have a stronger exoskeleton, and it's really good for fossilization. So their exoskeleton is made of calcite compared to our horseshoe crab's chitin. And so we have more trilobite fossils. We have a better idea of what they looked like, where they were, what they were doing. And so while we're not yet at our horseshoe crab, our trilobite is kind of serving as something that's kind of horseshoe crab-esque that we have in our environment at this point. And they also are proving to us that the body plan that horseshoe crab is going to use is at this point in our oceans. So now we can move on to the Ordovician period from 485 to 443 million years ago. And you'll see that this is going to be a really important time for our horseshoe crabs. Again, we've got our Earth in the bottom right corner, still looks pretty weird compared to our Earth today. In terms of climate, we would have had a greenhouse climate, so it would have been really warm. And this period actually ends in an ice age, which you'll see is really important for shaping the evolution of horseshoe crabs and also just all of our life on Earth. At this point in time, we don't have any complex life on land, so everything is just going to be in the ocean still, but getting more diverse alongside some really big changes to our Earth. So we have lots of tectonic plate movements, lots of volcanoes erupting, our sea levels are all changing during this period. So I mentioned the Cambrian period, but there's another diversification event called the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBE. That's really, really important. It's actually considered the most important or the greatest increase in diversity that we see in our Earth's history. And we don't really talk about it as much as the Cambrian explosion, which makes me sad, but that's okay. And so if we want to compare these two events, the Cambrian explosion is introducing body plans. So in simplest terms, you could think like a circle animal, an oval animal, a rectangular animal. But then the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event is really expanding that diversity on lower levels. So now we're getting types of circular animals, we're getting types of oval animals, we're getting types of rectangular animals. Again, this is like a really simplified example, but that's the kind of diversity we're seeing at this event. And then at the end of the Ordovician period, we do have a mass extinction, which wipes out a lot of our animals on Earth, but it doesn't wipe out our horseshoe crabs. And so people who are here have seen this. We have like a scoreboard. Actually, I don't know if you can see that because it's blurred. Sorry. But we have a scoreboard keeping track of mass extinctions and horseshoe crabs. This is our first mass extinction, and our horseshoe crabs are going to survive. So they're getting a little tally mark. I'm sorry for the people online who can't see that. But our horseshoe crabs have survived their first mass extinction, which brings us to our first true horseshoe crab, which is Lunataspis aurora. That's what this fossil is. And then there's also an illustration of what we think it would have looked like. So in 2008, this fossil was discovered in Manitoba, Canada, in rocks that were dating to 445 million years. And so that's why when we talk about how long horseshoe crabs have been around, we say they're 445 million years old, is because of this horseshoe crab. At that point in time, Canada would have been near the equator. And then we've now, for taxonomic classification, have put this one in the order Xiphosaura, which is why it's that true horseshoe crab. And so now, from this point on, when we talk about true horseshoe crabs, it's those members of the order Xiphosaura. Something that's really special about this one is that we think it had fused segments. And so those segments that we're talking about are in the opisthosoma, or the back part of the shell. So it's the back part of the shell here. Did I get my laser pointer? Nope, that's okay. But it's in this back part of the shell here. And those were fused together. And we at first thought our earliest horseshoe crabs had those segments unfused. So this is a pretty exciting discovery. And something that makes this horseshoe crab different from our ones today is that it was really small. And so this one only would have been a few centimeters long, which if you've seen a horseshoe crab, you know that's pretty small. So I mentioned this true horseshoe crab. We're also going to kind of talk about horseshoe crabs, which are this group called the Synzophosaurines. And so when we were first trying to get into our first horseshoe crabs, we weren't really sure if these ones were like an ancestor of the horseshoe crab, they were kind of like a sister or like an adjacent group, or what they were, but they have definitely a horseshoe crab-like appearance. That's what the picture on the right is. We see a lot of segments in that opisthosoma, which is the back part of their shell, but these ones were not fully fused together, and so this one could roll up. And so on like the bottom right of the figure, we see it's a little bit wavy. The Synzophosaurines could roll up, and they were living in marine habitats, compared to our true horseshoe crabs, the Xiphosaurans, who still had a lot of segments early on in their history, but that was all fused together, so it was one solid piece. They were living in mostly marine environments, but they were kind of adaptable to fresher water, and they're the ones that are going to lead to today's horseshoe crabs. So now we can move on to the Silurian period from 443 to 419 million years ago. We've got our Earth again in the bottom right corner. I've added some yellow stars of where we think maybe the horseshoe crabs were living. It's really hard to say exactly where they originated. All that's published about it is like in the shallow seas over Europe, which is difficult to say because Europe is a pretty wide area. We don't know exactly what land was comprising Europe at the time, but we know that they were evolving kind of near the equator. And so we've got some stars here over our shallow seas. Maybe that's where our horseshoe crabs were. You can use your imagination a little bit because we'll see later our horseshoe crab fossils are popping up all over the world. So unfortunately, we just don't know exactly for sure where they evolved. At this point in time, our climate's stabilized, so we're not seeing huge changes in temperature anymore, but it's still holding steady at a pretty warmer than today temperature, which is causing our glaciers to melt and our sea levels are still rising. Something really cool happening in this period is that plants are starting to appear on land. In our oceans, we're also getting coral reefs, which is making our ecosystems more kind of physically diverse, and fish are starting to gain jaws. So now we're getting some maybe new predators for our horseshoe crabs. Speaking of them, what are they doing? They're still small. They also still have lots of segmentation. So we can see in our fossil pictures and also this really kind of creepy 3D reconstruction, they still have lots of segmentation, but something that's special about horseshoe crabs at this time is that their legs and a lot of fossils we see are actually extending past the prosoma, which is that first part of their shell. So in our fossil, we can see like little bits of legs that are sticking out of the side of the shell. Our horseshoe crabs now, their legs are all kind of tucked nicely neat inside. They're still living in marine and coastal habitats, and our Synzophosaurines, which are those guys that could roll up, are still abundant at this point in time. So we've got some fossils of those. We've got a 3D reconstruction again of a fossilized horseshoe crab. We don't actually know where this fits in. And then we've got a fossil of a horseshoe crab that we think is a Xiphosuran in the bottom right corner. So now we can move on to the Devonian period from 419 to 359 million years ago. The Devonian is also known as the age of fishes because many fishes at this time were diversifying into both marine and freshwater environments. And so we kind of had fish before, but this is really where the fish are going to become the star of the show, especially in our oceans. At this point in time, plants are getting more advanced. So we now have ferns and we have trees that are growing into forests. Animals are also starting to creep out from the water onto the land. And so our first animals that colonized lands were arthropods, like our horseshoe crabs, but was not our horseshoe crabs. We also have at this point wingless insects. So some of those early arthropods, including scorpions, we're getting amphibians at this time. And unfortunately, this period is going to end with another mass extinction. But you know who doesn't get wiped out during the mass extinction? It's our horseshoe crabs. So they get another tally on the board. Yay. They just cannot seem to move, which is good for us. What are they doing? They're still small and their shape still varies and they still have lots of segments, but they're kind of starting to approach what we would think of as more of like a modern looking horseshoe crab. But something special now is that they're still living in marine environments, but some of them are also beginning to transition into freshwater environments, which is really interesting. I chose this fossil in the illustration because it's a really well-preserved fossil. This is of the specimen Piquetia carteri. I'm so sorry. It's of the order Xiphosaurus. So again, this is our true horseshoe crab. This one was actually found in Pennsylvania. So maybe this could be like the great grandfather of our horseshoe crabs living today. Now can move on to the Carboniferous period from 359 to 299 million years ago. So if we're keeping track of what our Earth looks like, our continents are kind of starting to smush together. Our climate at this point is still really tropical, but we also get widespread coal swamps during this period, which is how the Carboniferous period got its name. We've got lots of carbon. And that CO2 that's in the atmosphere is going to help our trees, who love carbon dioxide, to grow huge, and then they're going to produce lots of oxygen for us. So animals are going to use that oxygen, plants are going to use that oxygen, and animals like our reptiles, our winged insects, and our cockroaches, because of that oxygen, are now all starting to get huge. And so we see a lot of pictures from this time of like huge flying insects. That's kind of this idea, which is all cool, but our horseshoe crabs are still around and they're getting larger. Just like our other animals, they're still very diverse in shape at this point, but many of them are now living in those freshwater areas, in those coal swamps, and there's still just a couple hanging out in those marine environments. The Carboniferous period is considered the peak time for horseshoe crab diversity. We have around 50 species that have been discovered and recognized from this period in time, but our Synzophosurians, those guys that roll up, are starting to decline at this point. So from this point onwards, we're going to see mostly Xiphosurans. But we think at this time the Limulidae family is introduced, which is the family of horseshoe crabs that we still have around. So that is pretty cool. We've got two fossils here, one of the genus Bellinurus and one of Euproops, which are just two of the kind of more popular fossils that we have from this period. Euproops is especially cool because we have found a fossilized horseshoe crab where we can see its brain, which is really, really crazy because usually soft tissue like brains don't get fossilized. For whatever reason, the way this horseshoe crab was fossilized, its brain was preserved. And so in the little rectangle, we can see some like white kind of like circular branching system, and that's its brain, which we can see really clearly, which is cool. So we know around this point in time, our horseshoe crab's nervous system has developed to be similar, if not very close to the same as it is today. So this one, as I mentioned, was from Euproops danae. It's a member of Xiphosaurus, so it's a true horseshoe crab. It was found 310 million years ago in Illinois. It's very cool. Next, we're moving on to the Permian period from 299 to 252 million years ago. If anybody's a fan of Pangea, you might like this picture in the corner. At this point in time, we've now got the supercontinent Pangea. And with having a big, massive land like this, we're also now getting regional differences in climate. And so our land is all connected. Plants and animals can kind of move more freely, but it's very different depending on if you're more inland, it's going to be more dry. There's also differences in temperature across latitudes. So it's a very different world for them to be living in. At this point in time, our plants now have seeds. So plants like conifers are evolving. And unfortunately, our Permian period is going to end in another extinction. And this is a really, really big one. It's the largest recorded mass extinction with major changes to our climate, to our ocean chemistry. We predict that it's about 81% of marine species get wiped out by this, but both marine and terrestrial ecosystems are really, really impacted. There's one thing, though, that this extinction just cannot seem to get rid of, and that's our horseshoe crabs. So now we've got another tally for our horseshoe crabs. What are they doing? They're still small, and their shape still varies, but many of them at this point now are resembling our modern forms of horseshoe crabs. So if we're looking at these fossils, you could look at that and be like, yep, that's definitely a horseshoe crab. At this point in time, they're also still living both in freshwater and marine environments. And so we've got a couple families that we want to talk about. On the left side is the Australolemulidae, and then not pictured also the Lemulidae, which is the family we still have today. They're going to flourish at this time, so this is really a good moment for them. Unfortunately, Paleolemulidae, which is pictured on the right, is going to start to end here. Now we're moving on to the Triassic period from 252 to 201 million years ago. We still have a tropical climate. Our continents are still pretty connected, and reptiles are really starting to dominate both in the water and on land at this point in time. This is also the period where our first dinosaurs and our mammals appear. And we also get pterosaurs at this time, which, if you've heard of pterodactyl, that's like the more specific version of pterosaur, which is not actually a true dinosaur. I'm not like a super into dinosaurs person, so I can't give you the details on why that is, but they're not a true dinosaur. They are flying though, they're a vertebrate, they're kind of reptile-like, they're really cool. But this period, unfortunately, is gonna bring us another mass extinction, which is gonna wipe out a lot of those marine reptiles, which could be in favor of our horseshoe crabs if they had some marine reptile predators. But this is also gonna make room for the dinosaurs to really diversify. If you're keeping track, there's an extinction, there's something we need to do, which is mark off that our horseshoe crabs are still surviving. All right, and not only are they surviving, they're growing larger finally. And so at this point in time, they're gonna average between 10 and 20 inches, which is a lot closer to the horseshoe crabs we see today. But their shapes are very diverse, and this could come as a result of extinctions. Extinctions always make room for things to become more diverse, even though they're taking stuff out. And some of our favorite horseshoe crabs from this period have what's called genal spines, which are those like spines on the sides of their prosoma, which are overdeveloped. And so basically they're really long. Like our fossil here, Australolemulus has really long genal spines. Also, our horseshoe crabs are still living both in freshwater and marine environments. We think Australolemulus was a freshwater one, so personally would not want to be like in a lake or a river and see one of these guys, but apparently they were doing well. There's only one known specimen from this species, and it's the one pictured. Another really cool horseshoe crab from this period is called Vaterlemulus tricky. And I don't know if Vaterlemulus sounds familiar to anyone, but it's named after somebody really famous. Does anyone want to guess? It's named after Darth Vader, yeah. So someone who was a big Star Wars fan got a hold of this horseshoe crab and decided this was going to be Vaterlemulus. They thought the shape of the prosoma resembled Darth Vader's helmet, which I could see it, yeah. This one's also a member of the Australolemulidae family, but this one was found in Idaho, which is super cool because Idaho is no longer underwater, but was at this point. And this one is only 4 inches long. And so it's unclear if it as a species kind of ranged in that size or if this one just happened to be a young one. It's kind of a similar situation with a lot of our horseshoe crab fossils where we're finding small ones. We're not sure if they were more likely to fossilize when they were small or if they were that small. Unfortunately, it's just something that we won't be able to know. Now we can move on to the Jurassic period from 201 to 145 million years ago. So we still have a tropical climate, and of course, we're probably all familiar with Jurassic Park. So our dinosaurs are dominating at this time. We're also getting our first birds at this time, which is pretty cool. They wouldn't have looked exactly like our birds do today. They would have been kind of somewhere between a reptile and a bird. Some other cool creature features, we've got ichthyosaurs, got giant crocodiles, we've got sharks that look modern, and we've got cephalopods. And so our ichthyosaurs, our giant crocodiles, our sharks, all could have been predators for our horseshoe crabs. Maybe our cephalopods were a little yummy snack. Maybe they were a predator. Maybe they were friends. We'll never know. And so while dinosaurs are really cool, we're going to talk about something that's way cooler that's coming out of the Jurassic period, which is the Solnhofen limestone in Germany, everybody's favorite. And so this limestone is really famous if that's the kind of thing you're into, because it makes a really great building material. And so this area in Germany has been heavily quarried throughout the past because they wanted that limestone for building. But it's also in a really good location. So once upon a time, it was at the edge of a sea, and that water over the limestone had a really high salt content and was really oxygen poor. And so anything that died there had a really good chance of not, becoming eaten by scavengers who didn't want to live there. It also made really good conditions for fossilization. And so there are a ton of really well-preserved fossils that are coming out of the Solnhofen limestone. We're getting fossils of plants, soft-bodied things like jellyfish and octopus that don't usually get fossilized have come out of here. And of course, we've had horseshoe crabs. And so all of these horseshoe crab fossils, except for the one in the bottom left corner, were from the Solnhofen limestone, but even that one in the bottom left corner was still from Germany, so probably somewhere nearby. Some other cool fossils from the Jurassic period are this one, which is showing some horseshoe crab appendages. And if you're familiar with the way horseshoe crab legs look, it's basically this, which is really cool. So we know at this point in time, our horseshoe crabs had appendages that look a lot like our appendages we see today. For those keeping track, our horseshoe crabs are getting a little bigger. Their shape is very similar to modern, and they're returning to mostly marine environments. And so the genus Mesolemulus is the one that is pictured in most of these and is pictured here. It's one of the most popular ones, and it's one that we usually use to compare to modern horseshoe crabs just because it looks so similar to our ones today. So it's really easy to be like, look, they haven't changed. Some more fossils, of course, from the Solnhofen limestone. This horseshoe crab's trackways actually were fossilized, and it very much resembles the tracks that we see from their back pusher legs. And so we know from both these fossils and from these ones that our horseshoe crabs probably had legs that very, very much looked like the legs that horseshoe crabs have today. Now we're moving forward to the Cretaceous period, which is from 145 to 66 million years ago. Our climate is still pretty tropical. We don't think at this point in time any of the temperatures were below freezing, so a lot of our glaciers are melting, we have sea level rising, and our supercontinent is really starting to break up. On land, plants are getting flowers, and this period ends with another mass extinction, which is the one you may know for being the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, and many of our marine invertebrates. There's a super cool marine environment, or a super cool marine invertebrate. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the horseshoe crab. It did not get wiped out during this extinction, and so it's getting another tally on our board. What are they doing? They're still kind of smaller, but they're a lot closer to our modern horseshoe crab sizes, and they also look really similar to our modern horseshoe crabs. So from this point on, most of the fossils we see look very much like our modern horseshoe crabs, and they're living in both marine and freshwater environments. The one that's pictured here is Victolemulus mcqueeney. So it's part of that family Lemulidae of the horseshoe crabs we see today. This one was found in Australia, and this one is actually freshwater dwelling. But I've put it here because we have both the top and underside of this. The way it was fossilized and excavated was done very well, and so we can see the top and bottom of this horseshoe crab, and it looks, again, very similar to our horseshoe crabs we have today. Another cool fossil coming out of this period. So we can see just, the overall horseshoe crab on the top left side, but then the one next to it is actually its gut contents, which got fossilized, which again is really rare. Our soft materials don't usually get fossilized, but starting like at the top of the fossil, where it's kind of like triangular shaped and looks more solid, is actually still inside the horseshoe crab. And then the little like speckly bits that are to the bottom right of it are now outside of the horseshoe crab. And so from this, we can tell horseshoe crab was eating, looks like some little shelly bits, looks like a lot of sediment. And so we can assume from this that our horseshoe crab was kind of scavenging along the bottom, eating sediment, eating something shelly, which is again very similar to what our horseshoe crabs are doing today. So we also know at this point that our horseshoe crabs are probably eating and behaving very similar to our modern ones. From this extinction, we only have one lineage that's going to survive, and that's the Lemulidae family, and that's why those are the horseshoe crabs we have today. And so now we can move to our tertiary and quaternary periods, which I've lumped together, but these are from 66 million years ago to the present. So the quaternary period is where we're still living. This is known as the age of mammals. So we've got lots of marine and land mammals, including humans, of course. Hominids are going to evolve around 2.6 million years ago, which is why we have this cutoff of the periods here. And our species, Homo sapiens, is going to pop up between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. We're having a gradual decrease in temperature, so we're getting down to the temperatures we know today. Also getting some strong climatic zones, both by latitude and by like inland coastal. And we also have a lot of shifting of land masses. So our Earth looks very similar to what we know it as today, and that's going to help with evolution because things are getting geographically separated. If anybody's curious about the Delaware Bay, it's going to start filling in around 15,000 years ago. So very, very recent in the span of our whole horseshoe crab story. So we just jumped through like 500 million years, which is a lot. And I don't want you to worry about like remembering names, remembering exact dates. I've made a nice little timeline for you to think about kind of big themes in our horseshoe crab's history, starting with the Cambrian, where our arthropods evolved, and we have our oldest horseshoe crab fossil from the Ordovician. Then in the Carboniferous is when we have peak horseshoe crab diversity. Through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, our dinosaurs are going to rise and fall, but our horseshoe crabs survive, up to the Quaternary, which is the present, where humans emerge and horseshoe crabs persist. And so now I'm asking you this question again, looking at this fossil, looking at this horseshoe crab, has anything changed? Getting a lot of nods, which is great, because I would say yes. And so we know now horseshoe crabs have changed. They haven't always looked exactly the same. And so we kind of wonder then why people always call horseshoe crabs living fossils. This is a term that gets thrown out. Everything you Google about a horseshoe crab, it's like they're living fossils. They're living fossils. So why do we see this? First, what is a living fossil? These are some animals and a plant that have been given the name living fossil. Does anything look familiar to anybody? You can shout them out.
Is that one guy a goblin shark?
It is a goblin shark. Yep. So top middle is a goblin shark. Yeah, we've got a nautilus on the top right, a ginkgo on the bottom middle, crocodile on the bottom left, aardvark on the bottom right. Anyone recognize the top left one? Yeah, it's a coelacanth. So these are all pretty popular examples of living fossils. And so this term living fossils was coined by Charles Darwin, and it's actually only mentioned twice in On the Origin of Species, which is his, big famous work. I've quoted one of those instances here, which is that living fossils are species and groups of species which are called aberrant or just weird, which may fancifully be called living fossils. And so this is something that Darwin really said in passing. It doesn't really seem like he meant to give a lot of weight to this, but this is still something that's really persisted and doesn't necessarily have a definition, but this is something that people have tried to define. And so this is a figure from a study of examining some common organisms that we call living species. And they had 5 criteria for what makes a living fossil. Our horseshoe crabs got 3 out of 5 horseshoe crabs. So according to these people, they're like kind of a living fossil. And even some of these criteria, like resemblance to ancient fossil forms, we've now seen not all of our fossil forms look like our modern horseshoe crabs. So I'd maybe give this like 2.5 horseshoe crabs. I don't know. Whether you choose to call horseshoe crabs a living fossil is totally up to you. Personally, kind of against it. And I think they're a whole lot more modern than we give them credit for. Now, thinking about those more modern descriptions, the first horseshoe crab that was described by anyone was actually described by Linnaeus, who was the person who established binomial nomenclature, which is that like 2-part Latin scientific name that we give to organisms. He started that with the horseshoe crab and he named it Monoculus polyphemus, which means one-eyed, and then Polyphemus is the Cyclops from Greek mythology, who again had one eye. So Linnaeus is really fixated on the fact that horseshoe crabs have one eye, and so what he's talking about is this like bump in the front of a horseshoe crab, and they have simple eyes here, but I guess this was his like one eye of the horseshoe crab that he was thinking about. And then later in the 1700s and the early 1800s, our other horseshoe crab species are described. They've been given names like horsefoot crab, saucepan crab, helmet crab, king crab, basically a lot of crab names, but actually horseshoe crabs are not a crustacean. And by 1881, we had decided that that was outdated, but the name stuck. So if horseshoe crabs aren't a crustacean, what are they? So you've got a nice little tree here of our arthropods. And so on the pink lines, we have arthropods with jaws. And then on the blue lines, we have arthropods with fangs or pincers, also known as chelicerae. And that's what comprises the subphylum Chelicerata. So on the bottom right corner, I've got a picture of our horseshoe crabs chelicerae. They're circled in blue. They're just these little pincers that help them to put food into their mouth. Patrick is passing around some horseshoe crab molt so you can see their chelicerae up close. But we can see here that our horseshoe crabs are not in those pink lines with our crabs, with our crustaceans. They're over here on our blue lines, and they're more closely related to sea spiders and to arachnids like spiders, scorpions, and mites. So there's a little debate over where exactly our horseshoe crabs should go on this tree. Some people put them within arachnids, some people put them next to arachnids. Either way, all you need to know is that our horseshoe crabs are in the subphylum Chelicerata, and they're kind of related to spiders, at least more so than crabs. Oops, which brings us to our 4 modern species of horseshoe crabs. And so on the top left, we've got Lemulus polyphemus, which is that horseshoe crab that lives around here. They're found from Maine down to Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Their scientific name is Lemulus polyphemus. And so Lemulus means odd or askew, and then again, polyphemus is that cyclops. It's also known as the Atlantic horseshoe crab or the American horseshoe crab. Our other species of horseshoe crabs live around Asia. And so we've got Carcinoscorpius rotundicata, which is crab scorpion, round tail. And when they're talking about a round tail, it looks kind of pointy to us, but they're actually talking about the circumference. And so Lemulus polyphemus, for example, the circumference of that tail is kind of like triangular, but for this one, it's actually more rounded, which is why it's rotundicata. It's also known as the mangrove horseshoe crab. Next, we've got Tachypleus tridentatus, which is the Chinese horseshoe crab. It's also known as the tri-spine horseshoe crab. And those 3 spines are on the top of its shell on the prosoma. Those 3 spines is how it got its name. And we've got Tachypleus gigas, or the Indo-Pacific horseshoe crab, gigas meaning giant. And so these are our 4 extant or living species of horseshoe crabs. After all of those millions of years of changes in shape, these are the 4 that we're left with. And this is where you can find them. So as I mentioned, we have Lemulus polyphemus living off the North American coast, and then we've got our Asian species of horseshoe crabs in color. This map is pretty cool also because it shows both fossil species, where they've been found, and trace fossils, which would be things like those trackways, where those all have been found compared to where we're actually finding living horseshoe crabs today. So the title of this program was Living Fossils or Modern Wonders. So now is my time to try to convince you that horseshoe crabs are not a living fossil, but are actually a modern wonder. And so horseshoe crabs have been around for hundreds of millions of years, but the ones that are living today are just as modern as any other animal. We're all here at the same time. And so while they may have this ancient appearance, they actually have a really modern lifestyle. Maybe not as modern as this one here, we can dream, but there's a few things that we'll talk about that make them kind of more modern, and that's their genetic diversity, their advanced eyesight, and their relationships with shorebirds and with people. So in terms of genetic diversity, I really want to drive home this point that something can change in its DNA, but that doesn't always mean it's going to change in appearance. And so even though our horseshoe crabs have looked, more or less the same since the Jurassic period, that doesn't mean that their DNA hasn't been changing. And their DNA has been changing. And so in the course of their whole history, horseshoe crabs have undergone at least 2, but more likely 3 whole genome duplication events. So your genome is just like all of your DNA strung out, and over their time being on this earth, that has actually duplicated entirely, which is just giving them more genetic material to work with. So they are literally, they have more genes, which can then evolve. And so we think this most recent event happened in the Jurassic period, which is when those horseshoe crabs started kind of looking the same. So at least since then, our horseshoe crabs have been, they've had more DNA, they've had more genes, which sets them up to be more genetically diverse. In terms of genetic diversity in populations, it kind of varies based on which population you're looking at. And so Tachypleus gigas, which is one of those Asian horseshoe crabs, was found to be diverse in several populations in all of its habitats were found to be diverse. In contrast, Carcinoscorpius rotundicata was found to be losing diversity in several of their populations. Closer to home in South Carolina, their populations in 2020 were found to be large, diverse, and healthy, which is what was published. And in the Delaware Bay, there's a really good ratio of male to female horseshoe crabs. So we've got plenty of eligible bachelors out there ready to start some nice, diverse families. So genetically, though, horseshoe crabs are more than meets the eye. And speaking of eyes, the eyes of a horseshoe crab are really, really cool. And so they have 10 eyes in total. A lot of those eyes are light sensing eyes, but they have 2 eyes which see pictures like we do. Those are their lateral or on the side compound eyes. And so they're called compound eyes because they're made up of a bunch of lenses. There's about 1,000 of them, and they're really big. So this is a picture of a horseshoe crab eye that we just took with a normal camera. And so you can actually see all of those lenses without using a magnifying glass, without using a microscope, which is really cool. And we decided, why aren't we studying them? And so horseshoe crabs have given us a really good understanding of how eyes provide vision. So how we go from sensing something to actually inputting that and seeing it. So there's a person named H.K. Hartline who did a lot of work on horseshoe crab eyes in the early 1900s. He won a Nobel Prize in 1967, which is really cool. And a lot of that research continues to this day. What we've learned is that horseshoe crabs' eyes are very sensitive to changes in light. They can see in multiple directions and see up to about 5 feet, we think. And they're also really good at adapting to daytime and nighttime conditions, which is really important because our horseshoe crabs want to go lay their eggs on beaches at nighttime. So they need to know if it's daytime or nighttime. And so they're really cool. Another modern thing about our horseshoe crabs is their relationship with our shorebirds. And so if you live around here, you may be really familiar with that. Our migrating shorebirds have a very strong dependency on horseshoe crabs because of their eggs. So horseshoe crab eggs are the main food source for our migrating shorebirds. They give them lots of protein so they can fuel up to make their whole flight. And they've actually started to time their migrations so that they're stopping in the Delaware Bay, for example, when the horseshoe crabs are up laying their eggs. And so this is a really close relationship that hasn't always existed. So we didn't get birds until like the Jurassic and onwards. And so in the Ordovician, when our horseshoe crabs were evolving, there were no birds. This relationship didn't exist. This is a very modern thing. Another relationship that's very modern is our use of horseshoe crabs' blood. And so this is something, if you guys want to raise your hands or if you just want to like do the list in your head, either is fine, but I'll just read through these kind of quickly. If you've been to a hospital, if you've been to a medical clinic, if you've received an injection, if you've taken a prescription drug, if you wear contact lenses, if you've had some form of surgery, if you've had stitches for a wound, if you've had part of your body like a knee, a heart, or a hip replaced, and if you've received some form of vaccine. So just mentally think, can we check off any of those? Yeah, you're all nodding yes, because the answer is likely yes. And if you're nodding, then you can say thank you to a horseshoe crab because they have helped you. So horseshoe crabs have really, really special blue blood. In addition to being blue, there's a lot more things that are cool about it, but it's blue because it has hemocyanin in it. And so hemocyanin is copper-based, which makes it blue. Our blood is hemoglobin-based, which is our blood has hemoglobin, which is iron-based and makes it red. And so they have coppery blood, hemocyanin, blue blood. This blood is also diffuse throughout their body, so their circulation system isn't contained like in veins and arteries the way ours is. Their blood is just kind of in their body wherever it can fit between their organs. And so if a horseshoe crab were to get injured, that blood would kind of already be there. And it does something called coagulation or clotting, and that prevents the horseshoe crab from bleeding out. And so that blood is really, really good at clotting. It's also really good at detecting toxins. And so if there's any bacteria that get into the horseshoe crab's bloodstream, it can clot around it and make sure that that horseshoe crab does not get sick. So these special blood cells that are doing this coagulation and toxin detection are called amoebocytes. And that's how we've derived this test, Limulus amoebocyte lysate, to test all of our medical equipment. So our surgical tools, our needles, our vaccines, our shots, our contacts have all been tested using this test derived from horseshoe crab blood to make sure that it doesn't have any bacteria on it and that we don't get sick. And this is a test that is really highly sensitive and gives us super rapid results. If you're wondering, the horseshoe crabs are not bled like fully. They take about a third of their blood and then release them. There is some mortality associated with that, but that's definitely not the goal. And they are working on some synthetics, has not yet been approved in the United States. So for right now, we're still using our horseshoe crabs for the biomedical industry. So among all of these uses, now we're thinking of what's the fate of our horseshoe crabs. And so unfortunately, they have experienced some pretty sharp population declines. Up until the 1980s, horseshoe crabs were used as fertilizer, which in this area especially is really important since we have such a strong agricultural community. They've been used as bait and still are to this day to catch whelk and to catch eels. And then of course, they've been used for biomedical uses. So now people argue that we're in the midst of a 6th grade extinction. So we have our 5 extinctions on the board, and now we may be in the 6th. And unlike the past extinctions where there were volcanoes and there were meteors, this one is human caused. And so now humans have really disrupted our natural climate cycling. In addition to that, we've got a lot of habitat disruption and we've got general ecosystem disruption, which has a potential impact on all life on Earth, including our beloved horseshoe crabs. So now it's really in our hands. Will our horseshoe crabs continue to be a wonder to us, or will they just become another fossil? I'll let you think about that. Thank you guys so much. If you have questions, now is the time for that. But also here's my email and then the address for the Nature Center website, phone number if you want to call and chat about horseshoe crabs. I'm here all the time. But yeah, we'll take our first question.
Every lecture I've attended all of them. It was all excellent. I think you did a fantastic job, and I have no questions.
Thank you. So for those online, the comment was, "You did a fantastic job. I have no questions." I'm supposed to repeat questions, so yeah, we'll go in the back first.
The birds eating the eggs and the drop in the population?
Yeah, so our question is if there was any correlation between the birds eating the eggs and the drop in the population. Not that we know of, and so especially in the Delaware Bay, there's just so many horseshoe crabs that are laying so many eggs. In one season, they can lay between 80,000 and 100,000 eggs each. And now, not all of those horseshoe crabs are going to survive, of course, but there's, in this area especially, there's so many horseshoe crabs laying so many eggs that the birds have a big impact, but not really in terms of like horseshoe crab populations.
My question is also about the relationship between shorebirds and horseshoe crabs. So clearly the shorebirds benefit from the horseshoe crabs, but I was wondering if the horseshoe crabs derive any benefit from the shorebirds, or if it's more like it's just the shorebirds benefiting and the horseshoe crabs just aren't really bothered.
Yeah. So our question was, do the horseshoe crabs also benefit from the shorebirds, or is it just the shorebirds benefiting from the horseshoe crabs? As far as I know, the horseshoe crabs are not benefiting from it. It's just like the shorebirds are eating the horseshoe crab eggs. Yeah. Yeah.
The population of red knots, is that dropping, and that's affected by the drop in the.
Yeah. So was that a question or a comment?
Well.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about the red knot population, which is one of our migrating shorebirds, and how the horseshoe crab, eggs and populations affect them. Our red knots definitely are dependent on having healthy horseshoe crab populations that are laying lots of eggs so that when they stop here on their migration, they have lots of food. And so the decline in horseshoe crabs is definitely connected with a decline in red knots. Yeah.
I'd like to give some information. A lot of times, if the counts, and 10 years I've been coming, the counts might be low this year, but directly across on the New Jersey side of the bay, the population is up. So they'll come back and forth to either side of the bay. But sometimes you say, oh, there's a lot less this year than I've ever seen before. They're right across to the bay.
The comment was that a lot of red knots have been in New Jersey across the bay. All right, do we have any other questions in person before we take online questions? Okay, cool.
So, do you want me to unmute or do you want to repeat the question?
Either's fine.
Okay. So we've got a few comments that you can read later about how you did great. So
our first question is, are there any updates on legislation to ban the taking of horseshoe crabs for use in bait?
Okay, yeah, so horseshoe crab harvest is now very highly regulated, both for like bait, for biomedical use, all of it is regulated. So you have to have a permit to collect horseshoe crabs. It's regulated by the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission. They keep track of all of that data of how many horseshoe crabs are collected, especially in the Delaware Bay. You can only take males. They can only collect up to 500,000 like total, not per person. So no females, and only up to 500,000 males can be collected for any uses. Okay, cool. Well, I'll be around if anyone thinks of any other questions. But again, just thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
I'm just gonna stop sharing. So again, we want to say thank you guys for joining us today for our fourth lecture of our winter lecture series. For those of you online, we invite y'all to join us next week for our final lecture of the series, which will be Anthony Gonzon from the Division of Fish and Wildlife talking about Delaware's Wildlife Action Plan, which is kind of our main game plan for the conservation and protection of our state's threatened and endangered species. Other than that, I want to thank Regan again for an amazing program that dives much deeper than most people would think into the evolution of horseshoe crabs. Thank you guys all for joining us online. If there's any remaining questions, feel free to send them to us through email. We're always happy to get back to y'all and talk a little bit more about it. So again, thanks, Regan. Thanks for joining us, y'all.